All right, let's just jump right into it. Today, we're exploring a uniquely American solution to one of our most stubbornly gridlocked debates, gun violence. In this explainer, we're going to see how American market ingenuity, specifically firearm liability insurance, is stepping in where politics has stalled out, creating a really fascinating intersection of constitutional law, public health, and private enterprise.
Here's how we're breaking things down today. First, we'll look at a uniquely American challenge, then contrast rights versus privileges. From there, we'll dive into the market-driven surrogate, navigate some constitutional traps and hurdles, and finally wrap up with a culture of caution.
Section 1. A uniquely American challenge. Let's start by talking about the massive political gridlock that, honestly, leaves most of us feeling completely exhausted.
If you spend any time watching the news or scrolling social media, you know the drill. We constantly hear these extreme, polar opposite talking points. It's almost always either take everyone's guns or do absolutely nothing. But that binary totally ignores the practical middle ground of policy discussions. The reality is, almost no mainstream political group in the US is actually proposing going door to door to confiscate legal firearms.
Just look at what former San Jose Mayor Sam Liccardo admitted about his city's historic gun insurance ordinance. He flat out said, "There is no magical ordinance that stops street crime." And you know what? That is a massive, absolutely crucial admission. This whole new approach isn't actually about stopping active, malicious criminals. Instead, it's about treating gun harm, things like tragic accidental shootings and suicides, as a public health issue.
Moving on to Section 2, Rights versus Privileges. To really grasp why this approach is happening here, we actually need to look outside our own borders for a minute. Now, this is where things get really fascinating. Look at the stark contrast in these legal frameworks. It perfectly highlights exactly why the United States literally cannot just copy and paste the gun control models of other countries. In places like Australia, the UK, or Germany, owning a firearm is treated as a government-granted privilege. The burden is entirely on you, the citizen, to prove you have a genuine need, like sport shooting or pest control. But in the US, the Second Amendment guarantees it as a fundamental right. The burden is completely flipped. The government actually has to prove why you shouldn't own one.
And because of that flip, the strategies that worked overseas are basically dead on arrival here. Think about what Australia did after the 1996 Port Arthur massacre. We couldn't do that because sweeping mandatory federal buybacks would run straight into a brick wall, specifically the Fifth Amendment's protection against government property seizure without just compensation. So since traditional top-down confiscations and sweeping bans are legally impossible under the U.S. Constitution, American policymakers are forced to find a uniquely American solution.
Which brings us to Section 3, the market-driven surrogate. Here is the million-dollar question. If the government can't legally force certain behaviors, can the free market step in and do it instead?
Enter the market-driven surrogate. Instead of heavy-handed government mandates dictating exactly how you store your property, this concept leans on, well, everyone's favorite people, data-driven insurance actuaries. The whole idea is to bypass a completely paralyzed legislature and let the private sector quietly shape a culture of responsibility just by using financial pressure.
Let's break down exactly how this builds step by step. It starts with a simple government mandate requiring liability coverage. From there, insurance companies step in to assess the risk. Then, gun owners might voluntarily choose to buy a biometric safe or take a certified safety course just to lower their monthly premiums. And finally, if a tragic accident does happen, victims get guaranteed financial compensation without relying on taxpayer-funded emergency services to foot the bill. Think of this as the auto insurance analogy. It anchors this incredibly complex policy to something we deal with every single day. Just like having a clean driving record and airbags will lower your car insurance, having safe storage and training could lower your gun insurance. It's a system that's literally designed to reward good behavior rather than punish it. But let's pivot to Section 4, constitutional traps and hurdles. Because while that all sounds incredibly elegant on paper, turning the private insurance industry into a gun safety regulator is, well, it's incredibly messy in practice.
The moment we actually try to implement this free market mandate, we slam right into strict legal scrutiny and some massive operational roadblocks. When we stress test this policy, the insurance industry itself pushes back hard. First off, standard liability insurance legally excludes intentional criminal acts. They cover accidents, not homicides or armed robberies. So right out of the gate, this mandate doesn't cover the vast majority of actual gun violence. Second, criminals operating on the black market? Yeah, they weren't exactly going to call up an insurance broker to buy a policy. So this mandate ends up primarily impacting law-abiding citizens while completely missing the active criminals causing the most harm. Oh, and finally, actuaries just don't have the granular data yet to know exactly how much a specific trigger lock reduces risk, which makes pricing these policies a total nightmare.
And there's a massive constitutional trap lurking here too: disguised taxes. Imagine if a city forces law-abiding gun owners to pay exorbitant premiums into a fund to compensate victims of uninsured illegal street crime. Courts would strike that down in a heartbeat. Why? Because it acts as an unconstitutional, discriminatory tax on the Second Amendment. It'd be like charging a libel tax to every small blogger in America just to cover the lawsuits of major tabloid networks. Plus, any enforcement mechanism has to be incredibly careful not to accidentally create a backdoor government gun registry.
To actually survive the courts, these policies have to thread the needle and find a very specific legal sweet spot. Analysts point out that to stay constitutional, gun insurance mandates shouldn't ever require higher coverage limits than your basic auto insurance. If it's tied to standard low-level auto limits, the premiums stay incredibly cheap. We're talking around $20 a year. At that price point, it functions as a reasonable safety measure for accidental discharges or cases of mistaken self-defense, rather than a backdoor ban that just prices low-income citizens right out of their right to protect themselves.
Which brings us to Section 5, a culture of caution. Let's look at the real-world test cases and the ultimate long-term goal of these free market policies. San Jose really created the blueprint here, and states like Colorado are already following suit. Back in 2022, San Jose became the very first U.S. city to mandate gun liability insurance. To get around that data problem we talked about earlier, they just allow owners to use standard homeowners or renters policies. They also tacked on a $25 fee that goes straight toward public and mental health initiatives. And crucially, to avoid the terrible optics of throwing people in jail over missing insurance paperwork, noncompliance is treated as a civil violation. It can lead to having the weapon impounded, sure, but not criminal charges. Now, the Ninth Circuit has allowed the city to proceed for now, but they are absolutely still facing fierce, ongoing Second Amendment legal battles from citizens who feel they're being penalized for crimes they had nothing to do with. But ultimately, the long game of this uniquely American solution isn't about achieving immediate, overnight perfection. Think about it. We didn't solve auto fatalities by banning cars entirely, right? We instituted seatbelts and completely changed the culture around designated drivers. The goal here is similar. It's about fostering a society where clicking a gun safe shut becomes as unconscious and automatic as buckling your seatbelt. The law eventually just fades into the background.
So I'll leave you with this final thought. As we navigate the incredibly unique realities of American law, a landscape where we simply cannot copy the sweeping bans seen in other nations, will financial incentives and the private insurance market actually be the key to reducing violence? Can we find a way to internalize the cost of accidents and fund public health, all without infringing on the foundational rights of law-abiding citizens? It is a huge question, but thank you for exploring this really complex explainer with me today.